to acknowledge that we meet today on unceded lands of Lutruwita, home to the Lita Mariner, Taranaki and Panamanian peoples. We acknowledge their ancestors and future leaders as custodians of this country, its natural resources and the rich oral, design and creative history. Today's speaker for our People Histories, Oral Histories in Northern Tasmania, this is July, is Susan Aykut, is an academic and professional historian who's worked at 3 Melbourne universities, and she's found herself in Tasmania working with community care. And 10 years ago, I understand she was handed transcripts of some of the clients' stories. And so many of these stories are relevant to the history of Tasmania and Northern Tasmania. So she's finally got around to using the transcripts to form the body of her new book, I think, which is titled Extraordinary Lives. And this is what Susan will be giving us a presentation about today. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for getting out of bed on what has been a fairly bleak morning here in Launceston. Yeah, now as Vicky has said, this is, and thank you Vicky and the Friends of Qvmag for the invitation to talk today. You know, every time I come to give a presentation, I think, why did I just not keep my mouth closed, really? But then I remember I have something important to say. Although I'm doing the speaking, it's the voice of others that I want you to hear today. So that's why I'm here, to give a bit of a chat about a project that I've been involved in, well, really over a decade, I suppose, but without really realising that this would be what it would become. So what is the project? Well, the project is actually a book that's been compiled of 60 stories, and they're stories of clients and staff and volunteers of an organisation here in Launceston called Community Care Tasmania. And I'm not going to talk a lot about the organisation, only as it's relevant in this story, because the stories are basically from migrants, so people who came here after the Second World War, or their descendants. A lot of the staff were children of those migrants as well. And it's a really important story, I think, and became increasingly important as I put it together when I realised just the power of some of these stories. Now, there's quite an interesting... hang on, let me change the slide. So these are the stories that are there. There's 30 of them that are from clients and a couple of group stories, and there's 30 that are from the staff. And as you will see, they represent quite a lot of nationalities or ethnicities. So there's about 12 in the client group and about 14 in the staff stories, which is a reasonably broad cross-section. The photograph that's with this slide here are of the first 2 workers, really, for this organisation, or they were amongst the earliest. And they're a mother and daughter duo, Stephanie Fedek and her daughter Irene Suat. This photo was taken in 1968 when Irene was actually an entrant in the Miss Tasmania quest. So again, I want to try and link just what these lives coming to Australia and their impact in Australia, or in Launceston really. I'm going to try and do a lot of that, connecting the Launceston connection, given we are in Launceston, and that's where I think there's a lot of power. Capturing these stories, I should say that there's quite a backstory to that, which I should probably... I'm going to have to give you a few bits of context here. I haven't collected all of them. They've been collected over 35 years. The first group of stories were collected in 1999, yes, in the year of the International Year of Older People. And fortunately, the organisation, which was Community... Now, 1999, it's had a lot of names, this organisation, decided, well, in the International Year of the Older People, they fortunately had the foresight to put in a grant to collect some stories. So it's kind of random who actually spoke to the oral historian, who was Robin Friend. Anyone know Robin here? She's quite a well-known oral historian. So Robin did these interviews and the premise behind collecting the interviews, which is also important for some of the stories I'm going to talk about today, was to try and capture people's war experiences. And it was based on the premise that, in fact, you know, a lot of people that came here after the Second World War, you know, were busy building lives, you know, surviving. Like they'd survived through the war, surviving in a new country, learning what that needed, you know, language, jobs, having families, etc. But by the time they were a client of Community Care Tasmania, they were our older citizens. And with that, and there's a lot of older people in the audience here who will know or probably resonate with this, that there's a lot of time to actually reflect on what a life has brought and what those experiences have meant. And of course, for people who'd survived a war, it became apparent that, you know, there was all this assistance available, but did we really understand what that experience had been for them? And to actually provide the sort of care that they might need required a really deeper understanding of what they had experienced and what that trauma might have left in their lives that had resurfaced as they aged. So that was part of that process. Then there was a series, or there's some interviews that were collected by another historian who did a number of books on the hydro system. So she had gone around collecting stories from participants in the hydro scheme, which again is relevant to a lot of the stories I'm going to talk about today. That's Marilyn Quirk. I don't know if anyone knows about Marilyn's work, but Echoes of the Mountain. So there's a couple of stories that come from her that were of clients with Community Care. Then there's some stories that I haven't got a clue who collected them. You know, they're just kind of anonymous. These stories had a name and a transcript. Now that was it. No photos, nothing. So I've actually had to trawl around trying to find descendants, because most of these people are not with us anymore, to get some images, to let them know that we were doing this. You know, obviously there'd been consent when they gave the stories all those years ago, but for everyone to be comfortable that this is what was going to happen with them. And then there's the stories that I've been collecting over a decade, which again has been a fairly random exercise. They were done because I had a particular interest in something that somebody could talk about. One, and Basil, I'm going to talk about him today, was because when he first came to Tasmania, he went to the Fingal Valley, which is where I grew up. So I was very interested in his experience. Others were because they turned 100, or just, again, a very random selection as to why they were collected. And originally this book was going to be put together in 2020, and Maggie Peart, who is another local person, had come into the organisation, or had come to see me about volunteering in a program that I ran called the Community Visitors Scheme, and was actually really interested in this. So we did a big push to get a whole lot of interviews, which Maggie went out and did because I didn't have the time to collect those to get the book ready for 2020. Well, of course, as we all know, COVID put paid to that. That didn't happen. It got parked while we were busily trying to survive and keep everybody safe and healthy. So there's a range, you know, as I said, there's a range of stories in this book, and I've actually put a copy of it, or a draft, my working copy, which I'm not even sure is the most up-to-date one, of it at the back there, should you want to have a look at it to see who's actually included. But putting it together, and I don't know if any other people here have been putting stories together, but you often are faced with a number of challenges as to, well, how do you put some stories together when they've been collected over a long period of time by a number of people with different agendas or no agendas. But in fact, part of its power in this instance has been the fact that there was no set questions. It's really what people wanted to share at the time that they were interviewed. So they're not, you know, in-depth life stories. They are glimpses of people's lives at certain times that they've been recorded. So let's talk about why this project is important. If I change that. The reason I really gave credence to this, is, and as Vicky pointed out, I was given those 1999 transcripts and some that were from 2004, 2007, when we moved office in 2015 or 16. One of the dates. You'd think as an historian I would be across them, but I'm a bit fuzzy on some of these. And fortunately, they were handed to me because, as often happens when organisations move, things get discarded. So it wasn't until I was handed those and I looked at them and I thought, these are really extraordinary. They are in the first person because Robin is absolutely, who did those interviews for the 1999 group, was an absolute zealot for saying that, the power is in the way a story is told. So broken English, whatever, the pauses in their conversations. She was quite fanatical about keeping all of that so that you really got what they were saying as they said it. So their stories really, they talk about surviving a war and what that experience is, and I'm being a migrant to this country, like what that meant. And there's stories of the loneliness, the lack of English, to be able to talk to people, a huge upturning of people of just being displaced, as we know today. So many are in this similar situation. But a lot of them, because of when they came, of course, and I'm going to go on about that in a second, is what they contributed to Tasmania. And I'd just like to point out that while each of these stories are of migration and industry and of place, their richness is possibly greater, the whole of it, collectively together when you look at it. And that's what I've been looking at, and it's one of the reasons why I accepted to do this talk today, because I need to go back and finish the introduction, because you always write the introduction after you've got the book together, to see what is it telling me. And one of the things that stood out, because I started to graph all of the dates of all the details of people, because we didn't actually have that. In the organisation, it doesn't have that anymore either. All of that's gone somewhere because people have long since died and you only have to keep records for 7 years. That hasn't been maintained. So it was trawling through the National Australian Archive to find immigration papers as to when they came, where they left from, places of birth, where I could find those, and obviously places of death. Putting all that together, when I did that, of the 30-odd client stories, I realised how many of them were nonagenarians or centenarians, like an extraordinary number. And these are people who have survived rations, who've lived off grass. That's what they talk about, eating grass to survive. And I think, God, that's an extraordinary resilience in people to actually get to 100 or close to, in many cases. What is that saying about the resilience of these people? What is it saying? And I'm obviously no expert in this, but there are some studies that I have heard of that are looking at those, what makes longevity in somebody's life. And there are theories that potentially fasting in your later adult or early adult life, later teenage years, can actually have an impact on your longevity. So it might be something that this could be used for later for somebody to explore. Okay, here is a bit of a database accidentally put together. Obviously, it's an organisational history. It's putting together how this organisation came about. And it's an industry history, and I think something that I didn't realise until I started to look at that and think about, well, what does this tell the sector, the care sector, of which a lot of us will be using or have used. Here is a longitudinal study of an organisation over the last 35 years in an industry that was very new at the time. I mean, I think I was quite shocked to realise, even though we had services for aged care run by churches generally, the first government subsidised residential care is rolled out in 1963, not that long ago. And the pivot to actually putting care into people's homes, or to keep them living at home, is a much later exercise. It really doesn't come into being to the mid-80s. So community care was quite an early runner in this exercise. And the photo that I showed you of Irene and her mother Stephanie, they reckon they were working for community, on this in in 85 and 86. So right at the beginning, even before there's an idea that there's an organisation, they are actually working in this. And Irene remembers this quite vividly because she said, I know it's the year my youngest child went to school. Mothers don't forget that. They know when things like those kind of important dates happen in their life. So that's a really interesting thing, and I'm not sure that there is another community aged care provider that's actually looked or done a longitudinal history. I know in Tasmania or in Launceston, St Giles have written a history about their service, etc., which of course is a much older service and has a particular remit for children with polio in the first instance. So this is quite an interesting study, or potentially provides some data for anyone wanting to further that. Just before I go on, the organisation, and I actually haven't got its latest emblem, but you can see it came out of the Migrant Resource Centre here in Launceston. It was called the Migrant Resource Centre Community Options Service, which in itself became the successor to what was the Good Neighbour Council. Anyone know about the Good Neighbour Council? Because again, I'm always very fascinated with just how many things are remarkable in Launceston. And Launceston created its Good Neighbour Council in 1949, and it is still continuing today. It's the only one left in the country. No others exist. So I think that's quite, and there's a lot of the people involved in these stories who are connected to the Good Neighbour Council. I have spoken to people, in fact I've rung them because in fact it's their uncle, or it's, there's a family member in these stories. So it's still, but I love the fact that it still exists today and that it's the only one. The transition from being the Good Neighbour Council, this is an organisation that was set up to welcome people as they arrived here after the Second World War, those displaced people, and to help them assimilate. That's quite an important word, to assimilate into Australian culture. The change to migrant resource centres was actually a shift ideologically from assimilation to multiculturalism. So again, that's kind of a fundamental exercise in how we started to think about people coming in. Yes, we wanted them to be part of the community, but not to the detriment of, who they were and keeping that in place. So I just want to point that out as an interesting exercise, because if we go back even a bit further to why the Good Neighbour Council was created, is to look at immigration to Australia after World War II. Of course, most of us will be familiar with the idea populate or perish that was part of the thinking back in the late, or after the war. There was real concerns about Australia being incredibly vulnerable to hostilities coming from Asia in particular. Don't forget, this goes into a decade of, the Reds under the bed and a whole lots of other concerns that were part of that. But one of the biggest concerns, of course, was a labour shortage. We didn't have enough people in Australia to fuel Australia's industries and to project, to put them into, to create the industry and the world we live in today. Now, we might regret some of those decisions, but that's the case of the time. So Australia then put in, don't forget, we also had a White Australia policy that was put into place in 1901 when we were federated. So this presented a few difficulties because really we only took English people. After colonisation, we were predominantly British stock. And that was still the preferred group, and that was still who Australia pitched, the idea of coming here was to bring more Britons or British people out here, and that was the beginning of the £10 POM scheme that lots of us might know, might be connected to, I'm not sure, in this room. But more people were needed because not enough British people came. I think there was only about 7,000 in that initial intake from migration after the war. So what was Australia going to do? But really what they chose to do after that was to set our multicultural future in motion. So the how. How did people come to Australia? And again, I'm working on the idea that how I've got this organised in my mind is correct, and I might have to tweak it a bit, but this is where I'm at this point, is that, you know, through agreements with the International Refugee Organisation, or that was set up in Europe to look after the, well, estimated 12 million displaced people. Now, we probably have figures like that at the moment on the planet, which is an appalling situation to think that we've learnt nothing and we've still can't be kind to each other. So there was this idea to move, you know, they had to move 12 million displaced people. Australia put their hand up to take some people to fix the issues that we saw as an issue then at the time, which was, as I said, we needed labour, we needed manpower on the ground if there were future hostilities, etc. So they needed to broaden their remit. It couldn't just be the British because there weren't enough of them. So who were they going to ask for? What they did, and the organisations internationally were very happy to send people to Australia because they needed to provide the transport, which is why there's a little bit of a delay before anyone gets to Australia, because there wasn't the transport. But if they provided the transport, Australia basically took over care of those people once they landed. So to do that, they put in a 2-year contract for everyone that came, that they were kind of bonded, and that kind of thinking went on to quite late. You know, I know if you think in our training, we used to bond teachers to have their study, etc. So that kind of concept was put in place with migrants coming in. You came, you signed a contract, and you would be sent somewhere for 2 years working before you were allowed to go and do whatever it might be that you were skilled at or wanted to do. So the figures are quite extraordinary. By 1954, 170,000 European refugees came to Australia. So who did we have first? Oh, well, and by the way, they came to Australia by boat, and this is the first group that comes on, and that's the train to Bongilla. Anyone know about Bongilla? Anyone had relatives there? That's one of the migrant camps that was set up. That was a former army camp. It was, this is where most people went, and I'm putting this in for a reason, and that's the camp in 57. It was still operating till 71, and I'm kicking myself. I was up that way not long ago, and I should have made a special trip to go and see it, because it is set up as a museum today. One of the people who was possibly on that train in that photograph is this man, one of the beautiful bolts. These were the people that Arthur Colwell decided Australians might accept because they kind of looked like us, you know. They kind of fitted the bill. They were blonde, blue-eyed, they had the physical appearance. So they decided, yes, people from the Baltic states, and by that I mean Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, would come to Australia, and hopefully Australians would be all embracing of this group to come in. So lots of public fanfare at the time of them first coming out. Jonas, who's pictured here, was on that first boat and came to Bongilla. And that's where he stayed for 3.5 years, because he actually had some organisational talents that they realised when he got there. This camp was not set up for the migrants, the huge influx of migrants that were to follow. So he worked there in that, you know, helping set up the camp for the first 3.5 years that he was in Australia. He eventually comes to Tassie, and I'm not clear on the date of that. But what I do love about Jonas's story is, as you can see, he's pictured here with his wife on the left, Teresita, who was from the Philippines, and she wrote a memoir with Jonas before he died called Fits the Bill, because that's, of course, how the category of how he got into the country in that first wave of immigration. Jonas died a couple of months before his 100th birthday. So an extraordinary life. He ended up working as a fisherman. He worked down on the west coast in the mining towns, and they eventually ran milk bars and things in Burnie, and Teresita still lives there, or Terry as we call her, and she, as I said, put this book together. So an extraordinary life of that. So I'm going off, off script here. I should have a look at what I've had to write. Might be useful. So, but of course there weren't enough bolts either. The same problem happened as with the British migration. They ran out. They didn't have enough coming into the country. So what were they going to do then? So the Immigration Department, which was only formed in 47, I think, no, 46 maybe. Gosh, see, dates are not my good point. But it's an early, this is a post-war undertaking to establish the Department of Immigration. They decided, well, we've got to broaden the net. We're going to have to take other people. We will accept other people. So they did that with a range of groups. But the first group that I think probably comes in next are the Poles, the hydro Poles. And I think that designation was actually given by themselves. That's how they saw themselves, because nearly all the Polish people that came in worked on the hydro, all the men at least. So they come, and the reason they thought that this was a good fit was because a lot of Poles had fought alongside Australians, either at Tobruk or at the Battle of Britain. So there was, a hope that in fact that there was a good acceptance of these people because they had fought together. So they come from 1947 as well, so a bit later than Jonas came, I think, because that initial boat that came in, or a ship, let's get that correct, were all bolts. And for the most part they were accepted, the bolts I should say, but they were also known as the bloody bolts, not just the beautiful bolts. I should put that in. Australians were, a bit sceptical about all of this. Now, and the other reason a lot of the Poles come in is because a lot of them are already in England. And I'll explain a bit more about that with the stories I'm going to tell. And I'm going to talk about 6 of the hydro Poles, or the Polish community, or migrants that come. So you've got Joseph Schocker, Leon Kolka, Marian Zazula, Helena Conti, Anna Olek, and Wanda Sana. So I'm going to talk about these people who are all clients and the stories we've got. The stories, and they've been collected. Robin collected Joseph's and Helena's and Anna's. Marilyn Quirk collected Leon Kolka and Marian Zazula's, and I collected Wanda's in 2016. So we're going to start with Anna. Anna was a married woman when the war started. And I guess, again, let's put a bit of a context here about Poland and what's happened in Poland at the beginning of the war. In fact, you could nearly start the Second World War, or start cataloguing what happens in the Second World War with what happens in Poland. Poland, because of its geography, has an incredibly, as a crossroads in Central Europe, it's got a history that's blighted with one invasion after another. And the Second World War was really no exception. In fact, probably one of its bloodiest occupations. Because at the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the Russians and the Germans did a deal. It was under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I'm wondering whether that's where we get the Molotov cocktails from. But anyway, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact actually orchestrated that Hitler's German army would come in and take Poland from the west, and Stalin's Russian army would come in and take Poland from the east. The Poles had no chance in this. They were being divided from the get-go. Of those people that I was just pointed out, 5 of them were in Russian parts of Poland that were occupied. So, and Wanda was the only exception. She was actually in the German side, but they all experienced the brunt of this invasion and occupation. When the Russians came in, they actually moved Poles out of Poland. So they were sent, like Anna, she was sent to Siberia, along with her family, extended family. They all went. I'm not sure about her husband, but she never saw her first husband again. she's pictured here with her second husband, Jan. When they're sent to Siberia. When she goes to, now let me see if I can put this together. They go to Siberia, but then the Germans change their mind about this pact that they've got with the Russians, and they launch what's called Operation Barbarossa in 1941, where they think, no, we don't think we'll have the Russians in Poland. We're going to take all of Poland, and not only are we going to do that, we're going to invade Russia to boot. So they move into Russia. Stalin's a bit shocked. This is not what he'd expected. And there's incredible losses. As we know, Russians have had shocking losses during the First and Second World Wars. But what they do is then have an agreement with Churchill, and the Americans were also involved. Meanwhile, the Polish government have resituated themselves in England. So they're operating from England because now they've been ousted after the Poles and after Germany and Russia took over Poland. They've set up in England. So Churchill goes to Russia, to Moscow, to talk with Stalin, and with him goes a General Sikorski, who is one of the Polish government officials. And they pull an incredible deal off in some respects. They get to arrange to release all the Polish prisoners that are interned in Siberia and in other parts of Russia. They get the guarantee that they can form a Polish army on Russian soil under British command. So that's what they do. And that's what Anna does. She joins the Polish army, and she goes to Iraq and Palestine, and then eventually in Egypt, which is where she meets her second husband, who was also married. His wife was killed during the war. He also had a son who survived, and they did have contact with him. And so these photos just and the photo right over on the bottom right is of Anna's parents, who never left Siberia. So she never saw her parents again. This was a postcard or a photo they sent to her in the early 60s, which, and I can't read it from here, but basically, they say, we're tough and we've survived. And as you can see, Jan was one of the Poles, that picture of him at Bronte Park, taken there. And Anna became naturalised in 1958. And I'd just also like to, and you can see she's got a representative there from the Good Neighbour Council. And I also want to point out the Deputy Mayor there, Alderman Dorothy Edwards, who just prior to this had been the Mayor of Launceston. And I point this out because, again, it's another first for Launceston. She was the first woman mayor in Australia, which I also think is an extraordinary achievement. All these firsts, Launceston has a lot of them. I was talking about this with my brother last night, and I think we should, make much more of it. So Anna survives the war. Jan comes out to Australia before her. He's not going to have a bar of staying in England because he thinks Churchill, after the war ends, of course, who gets Poland, but Stalin, or Russia. So for a lot of Poles, they think the British sell them out. They've given away their homeland, so they're not going to go back. So he comes to Australia first, and Anna comes out a year later, and they marry here. One of the most remarkable stories I have found in this collection, or for me I just thought was an extraordinary story, is Helena's story, Helena Conti. As you can see, I didn't have a photo of her. I've tried to track her son down, who does live here somewhere, but I've not been successful to date. In fact, there's only two families I've not been able to make contact with, which is a bit sad. But anyway, anyone know Joseph Conti? Let me know, please, because that's her son. But Anna's story is extraordinary too. Like Anna, there's a knock on the door. She's on a farm. She's 13, no, maybe a bit younger than that at the time. Her father's handcuffed or, tied up, and her mother's been is given half an hour to pack some belongings of a life. Half an hour and you're gone. And they're all sent to Siberia as well. So when the British intervene and set up, or have people released from the internment camps set up throughout Russia and particularly in Siberia, Helena goes with her family to Uzbekistan, where there is a British Polish-run camp, army being set up. She's got 2 older brothers and a younger brother with her and her parents. So obviously, well, when I say obviously, from what I can tell from her memoir, her 2 older brothers join the Polish army because they are of an age to do so. But she and her younger brother and parents are basically living in a camp next to what is the army camp. But there's no food, there's no jobs, and her father dies of starvation. Anna takes her younger brother to an orphanage in Uzbekistan and says, we can't feed him, we can't look after him, can you please look after my brother, which they do, and they say, you should stay as well. And she says, no, I have to go back to my mother, which she does, and her mother dies again of starvation 7 weeks after her father dies. She buries both of them. She's 14 at the time. After that, she does go into an orphanage. She goes into an orphanage in Iran, and then she's sent to an orphanage in what was then in Karachi, which was still India at the time. And in India, she contacts the Red Cross to try and find her younger brother. She eventually, through Red Cross, tracks him down in Tanzania. So she travels to Tanzania so she can be reunited with her younger brother. She's there for a little while, but then they need work, so they go to Kenya, and she gets a job there, and she marries an Italian who had also fought in the war. They have 2 children. They live through the Mau Mau uprising in the 50s and realise, actually, there's no future here for us in Africa. So in the mid-60s, she comes to Australia. She moves to Sydney. Well, the family moves to Sydney. They've got 2 children by this stage. Her daughter has malaria. She suffered malaria in Kenya, and she knows her daughter has a bout of malaria when they get to Sydney. She goes to the doctors and she says, my daughter has malaria, can you please give her the medicine that's needed? In Kenya, she'd have just gone to a pharmacist and bought that over the counter. In Sydney, that wasn't possible, and in Sydney they said, no, we don't have malaria in Australia. So they don't treat this child, and she dies. Of all the people, Helena dies when she's 77, so she doesn't have an exceptionally long life. But I just find that this woman, who's had to travel across 4 continents and 8 countries to find a home, is quite an extraordinary journey. And yeah, I find it a very powerful story to put that in a context of what people were forced to do at the time of this. Leon Scholker, again another of the hydro poles. Leon was in the army before the war because enlisting in the army was compulsory, and as he writes, well, you wouldn't not want to be enlisted because, you'd never get a girlfriend. People would think something was very wrong with you if you hadn't done your army service. So he was actually already in the Polish army at the outbreak of war. When the Germans invaded, and the Russians invaded, he was in the north of the country, and he was in Lithuania, actually, when he was interned. He didn't go to Siberia. He went into a camp in the European part of Russia, at Minsk, and then at Solmesk, and that's where he was. Obviously, again, when the treaty was arranged with Russia to create a Polish army, he stepped up and was able to join. He wanted to, and the Polish army needed Air Force pilots, so he thought, okay, I'll be a pilot. So he goes to England to do his training, and he's told, well, he lands like a kangaroo, which was a reference he had no understanding of till he came to Australia, but he ended up becoming an air bomber anyway, just not a pilot because they didn't want people landing planes like kangaroos. He was going to go to Canada, but he actually put out, again, this is another interesting thing, he sent out in the world letters to newspapers to get pen friends. You know, this was to make some connections to find out where he might go next. And he was expecting to go to Canada, but there was a pen friend he had in Sydney, who, as it later turned out, was actually the woman who received the letter at the newspaper, and she never published it, but she wrote to him. So he came to Australia, but he didn't want to sign the contract when he came here. He didn't want to be contracted. He wanted to go to Sydney, not to wherever they might send him. But then he was threatened with being deported for not signing the contract and basically doing as he was told. So he came, said, oh, okay. So he came to Tasmania and ended up working on the hydro scheme at Bronte Park and at Butler's Gorge as well. Like many of the Poles, after they did their 2-year contracts, they went to the big centres, either Hobart or Launceston. So Joe came to Launceston. He had done some carpentry work during his time on the hydro scheme, and so he became a builder, and building the church that you can see there, which still exists in Kings Meadows in Hobart Road. It was one of the jobs he worked on, and he was later married there in 54. The church was finished in 52 and he was married there in 54. He married an Australian. A lot of Poles did have intermarriages. So he married an Australian because he thought, this is my home. I don't, a lot of Polish men did look for Polish wives, but he was happy to look further afield and married Irene, his wife, there. Leon Kolker, another Pole, also married actually a Dutch woman, so he likewise. But Leon's wasn't wedded to being married. Oh, there's a bit of a pun. Wedded to being married to a Polish woman. Leon was in a different part of Poland, which has its own kind of cultural mores, the Kashubians, and when they were occupied by the Germans, they were made to become temporary German citizens, and he was actually drafted into the German army towards the end of the war. Not as he was a non-combatant unit that he was put into, where they did all the auxiliary things like minding the horses, etc., etc. But then towards the end of the war, in February 45, they marched into northern Italy, and where they were taken over by the Americans, and then they were transported to a camp near Naples, which was to the Polish army that was under British command. So he ends up in England as well before immigrating to Australia. When he goes to, obviously he's, I can't even see what I've put there. You can see here he is at Wadamana in 49, down in the bottom left. And the Poles that come to Launceston settle in Kings Meadows primarily. It's always interesting how communities will gravitate together, understandably, language, shared culture, etc. So when he built his house, which is in Shirley Place, which he built in 53 and before he was married to Anne, his wife, in 55, I think there were 11 Poles, he says, that built houses, were building in that area at the time. So they come with great industry. Now, again, he also had some carpentry skills. So he becomes a builder in Launceston, and he is responsible, or his firm, his company was responsible for building what was the meeting house for the Polish community here in Launceston. And I can't even see what that is. That building, and again, another testament to the resilience of communities creating a life for themselves and a future for themselves, took 12 years of fundraising. There's no government assistance to build this building. So 12 years of fundraising, and it took them 10 years to build it. And so this became the centre for Polish life here in Launceston. for, well, up until when it was sold, which was in 2013. I haven't got that date there, but it was in 2013. The photo below is actually Leon, taken not long before he dies actually, at the opening of what is now the Polish monument that we have in Launceston, which I'll put up here. Most of you would know this particular site, so it's the Polish Pioneers Monument. So they used the money from the sale of that building to build this monument. And obviously these are, there's been quite a few monuments that the Poles have built around the place. There's one up in the Trevelyan Dam as well that they did, a barbecue area I think that's got some cairns and things that, for their comrades that helped to do that. The idea, as I understand it from behind this monument, is, these 8 columns represent the 8 destinations that the Poles built on the hydro. So what have we got? We've got Taralaire, Bronte Park, Butler's Gorge, Wadamana, Poatina, Trevelyan Dam, Waiatana and Laiwini. And obviously they're kind of beacons of light because that's what they do. And I understand, and I've never seen this, and somebody might know this, but I understand on a clear day or a clear night you can actually see these light beams from Georgetown and Deloraine. So very symbolic of their work with the hydro, bringing power to the state. Marian Zazula, likewise, another Pole who comes to Australia and works for the hydro. He and Joe Schocker actually are part of a big mass naturalisation that takes place at Butler's Gorge in 1948, which was an unusual thing at the time because you generally had to be here for 5 years before you could become a citizen. But in Marian and Joe's situation, that was expedited because they had been part of the British colony family because they'd been in the army. So they were all naturalised in 1948, big hullabaloo about all of that. And Marian's memory of that in his memoir was that he didn't really have much of a choice because it was kind of a coerced naturalisation, because if you didn't, then you stayed at the camps, or you could leave if you became naturalised. So that's what he chose to do. Again, here he is pictured in Kings Meadows in 1953, at the time of his wedding. Marian fought in Italy, and as you can see, he achieved and received, great. He was in the Signal Corps, medals for his war efforts, etc. And I'm interested that he went in 1977. I'm not sure that he ever went back to Poland. Again, not all the stories tell you all the details, so there's a lot of subjectivity about what's there. But he does go, this photo shows, to Adelaide when they erect the Katyn Massacre War Memorial there, which was where 22,000 Poles died. And Anna Olich's first husband may have been one of those casualties as well. The next Pole is Wanda. I met Wanda in 2015. By that time, she was no longer a client of the organisation. She had gone into aged care. She had quite advanced dementia. And I remember getting a call from Mount Esk, which is where she was, saying, we don't know what to do with Wanda. She is so sad and she's so unhappy, and there are all these memories from her early life that we can't kind of grapple with. Do you think you could find someone who might visit her? Which I did, and it was one of the best success stories of that program. The Community Visitor Scheme was about matching volunteers to visit socially isolated people in residential aged care. But Wanda had been a client of community care for quite some time, and the story that she reverted to as her dementia increased was about the death of her father and brothers who she witnessed being shot. She was in the German-occupied part of Poland, so there were basically daily reprisals in the street of people being executed at whim, and she actually witnessed, as I said, and this is in the records of the organisation, and certainly was in the memories of staff who knew her when I interviewed her, that she was there the day her father was shot. He was 45, and her two brothers, and I think they were 15 and 17 at the time. She also lost two sisters. Her mother and her were the only two of her family that survived. So the staff who used to attend Wanda used to say her house was extraordinary. Wanda was extraordinary. She had this sartorial splendour, like she used to go around with wonderful big-brimmed hats, wide-brimmed hats, because she had a bit of an issue with one of her eyes, and I think it was to disguise that. And her house was all colour coordinated. As you can see, someone had a photo of her kitchen, which was all yellow, and there was a pink room, and there was, so everything was quite remarkable. And they remember her telling them that story about that. And she said, and they also told me, and I never saw this, but that she had a photo of the bodies of her father and brothers in the cart that they were thrown into after they were executed. The day I interviewed her, even though she did have quite advanced dementia, was one of those days where she was quite lucid. She didn't really remember if she had been a teacher or whether she was a mothercraft nurse, or what her profession was, but she certainly worked with children. She didn't have any children, but she did work with children. And with the photos, there was quite a lot that she was able to tell me that I was able to record. But I did that interview with the person who I matched, or who was visiting her through this scheme, who interestingly was Russian. Fortunately, I had checked before that it wasn't through the Russians that her family had been exterminated, but the person who went to visit her likewise, was a victim of the war. Her mother, she was born in Latvia, in Riga, during the war, never met her father. Her father was carried off by the SS a couple of months before she was born. So she had this one, what I called an Eastern melancholia, like they got each other, and it was really interesting. Wanda told her story, because this is one of the things the staff had huge problems coming to terms with, this terrible tale that she had to tell of her war life. She told Sasha, who was visiting her, she told her once, and she obviously knew that Sasha got it. She knew exactly what that meant. They never discussed it again. For the rest of the visits, which lasted for the next year of Wanda's life, and she also lived to 100, were kind of happy things, They talked about flowers and lots of wonderful things. So there was a bit of a positive to that. And again, another extraordinary story. She was an extraordinary lady. The polls weren't... I'm going to move over that, but it was just to give you an idea of just how many people were coming into Australia. So in 1947, there were only 9 non-British migrants calling Tasmania home. By 1954, there's 2,602 non-British migrants in Tasmania. Not a huge number, but a significant number if you think going from 9 to suddenly several or a couple of thousand is a big adjustment, I should imagine, for most Tasmanians. And that's kind of relevant to where I'm going next, because the next group, and I'm not sure, they're probably at the same time as the Poles are coming in, because when I look at their dates, are with the Ukrainians. Of these 3, Basil, Stefania, or Stephanie as she was known, who was the worker that I pointed out right at the beginning, and Maria Hernick, who's in the end slide, they were all taken into Germany and became forced labour for the German army. Basil moved coal throughout the time through the duration of the war. Stephanie worked on a farm, and Maria worked for a doctor. Now, Maria's experiences, from her memory, was really quite happy. She wasn't unduly victimised or, miserable about her experience. Stephanie hated it, she says, you know, I didn't leave my home, I was taken from my home. Basil, you know, wakes up one day there's just people on the street, the next day there are Jews and non-Jews. He was put into a Jewish camp, even though he wasn't Jewish, so he's not there for very long before they realise, you know, Basil, even when I met him in his mid-90s, huge man, very tall, 6'6", living on an oxygen tank because of the coal dust, I'm assuming from those years, was, you know, sent off to work as a labourer. Ivan, the man who's pictured at the far right, doesn't tell me in his memoirs or what he has to say, what he did in the war or what happened to him, so I can't be sure of where he ends up. Basil, I interviewed in 2015. I was particularly interested, as I said, there was some interviews, he was one of them, that I went to meet to talk to him about what happened when he came to Australia, basically, or to Tasmania, because he ends up working on a farm in the Fingal Valley of a property that I knew, and I was interested to know what his experiences were. And and this is 2016, so he goes there in 1947 or 8. So it's a long time, but his memory of it was not pleasant. He was not a happy man. You know, the Ukrainians, and potentially because of their association with Russia, I'm not sure, but they were not particularly welcomed. When he was there, he said, you know, Susan, I was in a camp, and he said, I feel like I was very much in one again in the Fingal Valley. So his time was not happy there. He does have a happier story after leaving, after his 2 years being bonded on that farm. He goes to Campbelltown, and there he's taught English by Jeff O'Brien. I don't know if people knew Jeff. And I should imagine that was through the Good Neighbour Council, because there was a branch set up in Campbelltown. So he learns to speak English because he's got no English, and he comes with his wife, Paraskovia. So they're both together in this. He's taught carpentry skills by somebody in Campbelltown, and eventually that's what he makes his own trade, is to be a builder. A lot of people end up being builders in this cohort that I'm talking about today. He ends up coming to Launceston. He works for Bank Constructions, and he's responsible, or Basil worked on a lot of the houses, the commission houses that were built around the Punch Bowl. Stefania, when she's married when she comes to Australia. When she arrives, she and her husband are split up. He's sent to Campbelltown to work for a company, a kiln dry business in Campbelltown, and she's sent to Escley to work there for, you know, which was a home for disabled people, so she's working there. Even when they are allowed to see each other at the weekends, they're not allowed to stay together, even though they're husband and wife. That's their experience, and she also writes, we've got on record that when they set up home in Launceston eventually, you know, they could see that the neighbours would just be peering through the fence, looking to see what they were doing, just to see how strange these foreigners really were. Now, the Ukrainian community settle in St Leonard's. So that's where the enclave there's only about 20 families that probably end up out of the Ukrainian migration. A lot go to Hobart, but 20 families settle here in Launceston, and they settle in St Leonard's. Maria and Ivan become partners later in life after they've lost their respective spouses and spend a lot of time together. Ivan actually had a poultry farm, about 40 acres poultry farm on Quarantine Road. I'm not sure if anyone remembers what that might have been. I've got a feeling I used to go there with my mum to get eggs a long time ago. But he records, you know, to buy a house then was £50. Now that's an interesting price for a house, £50. Like the Polish community, of course, they help each other. Both groups, or most of these communities, they spend their weekends building each other's houses. So they take a while, but that's what they do. This photo shows, on the left there's Stefania, or Stephanie, as she was called, that's when she arrived in Australia in 1948. And the picture on the right is of the Dom Voska, which was the building that the Ukrainian community built in St Leonard's. And that was sold in 2007. And the other interesting thing I thought about found about the Polish Ukrainian community was that, you know, they set up a church. Obviously, faith is a very important connector for communities, and they set this church up, which was a Catholic church, it's the Holy Family Ukrainian Church. Again, the story of this church, and there's a picture of them of a group of them in 1992, taken at that church. The story of this church intrigued me because the church had been moved from the defunct mining town of Pioneer in 1947, then adopted by the Ukrainian group. It had, you know, Stephanie was really the last of that Ukrainian group. She died nearly 2 years ago. But they dispersed, you know, they had kind of assimilated and moved into other parts of town, didn't have a great need for this church. So it was sold again and dismantled, and it goes to Colebrook in 2019, where it's now part of the Notre Dame Priory, a Benedict monastery that was founded there in 2017. Go figure. I mean, I just thought that was an extraordinary little... so this church just keeps being picked up and moved around Tasmania. Oh, I'm still... God. All right, let me get a wriggle on, sorry. Okay, let me go back to some...
Anyone got parking set for an hour?
Oh, God, have I really talked that long? See, there's no clock. Sorry, and I've paid no attention. Okay, let me just quickly talk about getting married. You know, often the men came first and women followed later because it was often the men's labour that was wanted. So getting married was always an interesting exercise. Pep Wildeboer, who's 102 now, she married by proxy in Holland. Her brother stepped in because her husband was actually in Indonesia. Don't forget, a lot of the Dutch that come to Australia come via Indonesia after the Dutch are thrown out of Indonesia. So she marries her husband, as I said there, and they do settle in Indonesia for 6 years before they come here to Australia and set up a dairy farm. Maria Frangentello, she records, you know, she was engaged and her husband comes to Australia, and it's the 4 most miserable years of her life, not because she's not with her husband, but because she's an engaged woman. She's not allowed to do anything. She can't go to the dances. Her life is on hold. She's in limbo as an engaged woman. So that's why she figures it was the most miserable time of her life. Tony Bolsonaro, loved Tony's story when I heard, you know, she said, yes, well, I got married, says, when I came to Australia. Well, she said, I think I got married. But she said, you know, the service was in English. I didn't speak any English, so I've never been really sure whether that was what happened. But as far as I know, that's when I got married. And families came in different groupings as well, but I won't go into that. What a lot of the women did, so here we've got, well, let me start with Maria Hernick on the right. She, who I've just introduced you to, she ends up working for Waverley Textile Mills, which of course is the longest continuously running mill in the state. Elise Doya, a Dutch woman, again of Indonesian, but she was born in Java and her mother was Indonesian, but ends up in Holland for education, marries there, they migrate, they have a farm, or go to, her parents come out actually, and they go to a farm in Scottsdale, end up in Launceston eventually. She works at Coates Paytons, which was, you know, the biggest employer of women in Tasmania at one time. And of course, these textile mills, what are they run by? Power. How have they got the power? Because all of these migrants have built the hydro system. So, yes, I won't go any further than that, but that's really where we're at. All I can say is that, you know, the huge influx of migrants after the war changed the face of Australia, and by 1971, 1 in 3 people living in Australia was a migrant or a child of migrants. The stories in this book, and as I said, there's a copy of it at the back there if you want to have a quick flip, fall into that category. You know, they are these migrant stories. And you know, what they've contributed, what they went through, what they've contributed is, in my mind, something worthy to have on record, which is why I have thought it was really important that this gets into print so that there is somewhere, you know, it'll go into a library, that there's at least somewhere that people can consult and know that their voices and their stories are heard. Thank you.
Any quick burning questions that you'd like to ask Susan?
Yes.
Susan, it's about
Oh, hello, Malcolm. One of my greatest volunteers. You should be in this book, Malcolm. Yeah, go on.
it's interesting that you haven't got anyone from England. Those stories from the English language.
Yes, there are. In the book there are. There's some stories of Australians, not many. One of the staff members who was one of the 10, you know, a child of the 10-pound POMs. So, again, Malcolm, I have to say that it's kind of random how it's come together. But I can tell you that there are stories of people around the state through the staff. There are English and Australian stories. I did an interview last year of an Australian who grew up in Kings Meadows as well, who turned 100, who was in the Australian Army, so fought in the Second World War. So there are some other stories as well. I've just picked out the migrants just to talk about that because really I went to work for this organisation because of that migrant communities and connection. I was very interested in exploring that. Yeah. Oh, good to see you again, Malcolm. Anyone else got any questions? Sorry I've gone over time.
That's right. I think we have. Yeah.
I did look for a clock when I came in and didn't see
I
one.
should have looked at my phone.
And I've put a watch on and completely ignored it.
That's what.
Got a big story to tell.
I know. Do you have to find a publisher? How are you?
The idea is I no longer work for Community Care Tasmania, but I finished up earlier this year. The plan is that I'll finish the introduction and they'll get it properly proofread. I need to talk to the proofreader though, because when they go to, you know, correct broken English, I'm going to put my foot down and say, no, you can't do that, and lay it out properly. And it will probably be launched later this year. There's where the organisation is now, which is at Techno Park in Kings Meadows, they've just built a respite centre and a training centre for excellence, which will be launched later this year. And I said, well, and I did tell the board, I said, look, you can look like you're about buildings, but if you want to remind people that you're about people, this is when this book should get launched. So hopefully they will honour that. Otherwise...
You have to keep in touch because I'm sure that a lot of people would love to go to a book launch, particularly. It's fantastic.
Yeah, they're really, you know, they're simple stories, but and some of them are not simple by a long shot. They're extraordinary in what they have to tell you. As I go back to Helena Conti's story, you know, her journey, yes, you know, and to bury your parents when you're 14, having watched them starve to death. You know, Marion Zazula talks about eating grass. That's what he survived on. It's those things that they just put in there in that journey that you think, wow, you know, extraordinary. And, you know, we have so much to thank for that diversity in communities that come from people coming from different places, bringing those experiences, bringing their talents, their culture, their food, everything else that we enjoy.
Interesting. I mean, you think, okay, it's a process you need to go through, and to have this for future generations, are they going to be interested? I'm sure they are. Actually, I ended up at Watamana Power Station with my 3 girls, and I think when they went there with school as an excursion, it hadn't been set up, but now they've got a fantastic interpretation that Arts has, I think, Roving Curators program have done. And that was just amazing being able to unpack some of the stories. Like some of those faces seemed a little bit familiar with the one with Watamana and the structure of the dam and things there. So, I mean, people are really interested. Young people are still interested, and there are so many stories that I think our neighbour, was from a Polish background. So, yeah, just putting all those threads together for a lot of you too.
Yeah, you probably don't have to scratch very far or look very far to realise, yeah, oh, they were neighbours. Oh, I remember that. Or there's those connections.
And the football clubs too, because my husband's in was president of one of the football clubs which were then set up by the Polish Association. So there's that fabric through soccer.
Yeah, and I do, and I love that the way communities build things. I just recently went out, I'm potentially going to do a story about the first Sikh family that came to Launceston in 1969, which again is still before the White Australia policy. And this couple actually have, you know, they've dedicated, or half their house has been used as a Sikh temple for the last 30 years, unofficially, and officially for the last 8 years. They've now donated land and they're building a temple. This is Grindelwald. And I love that symbiosis of here, a Sikh temple as you go into Grindelwald is going to exist, built by another migrant who, although was Dutch, had this vision of building a little bit of Europe in Tasmania. And yeah, it just intrigues me.
Can everyone just thank you? Put your hands together.